February 12th edition of our wonderful CASE and CSA Sociology of Education webinar series. We're excited to present our session entitled Black Studies, Intersectional Identities, and Academic Success in Canada. Today, while we meet here on a virtual platform, we should take the moment to recognize the importance of the land on which we are located. We acknowledge the territory to reaffirm our commitment and responsibility in building positive relationships between nations and in developing a deep understanding of Indigenous peoples and their cultures. From coast to coast, we acknowledge the ancestral and unceded territory of all Inuit, First Nations, and Métis peoples. We invite you to learn more about the territory on which you reside. There's the link below. So for today's session, to engage in this session, we do have closed captioning available as a live transcript. For your questions, we will save them until the end. We'll have approximately 30 minutes for a Q&A session at the end. You can post your questions in the Q&A. You also have the ability to upvote to the top of the list as well. So we will be addressing the questions in sequential order. So please note that your name and question will be visible to that. I agree that in terms of the acknowledgement, given the theme, it's important for us to acknowledge our ancestors. So I think it's important to look at the Indigenous lands and also stolen African labor that was part of building these cities. And the BCSA, which is the Black Canadian Studies Association, land acknowledgement is just something to add. So I just saw that in the chat. So thank you for that. Next slide. Okay, so for today's presentation, I'm very excited to introduce a wonderful colleague and fantastic emerging scholar, Dr. Rhonda C. George, who will be presenting today on Towards a Black Studies Education in Canada. In addition, we have Dr. Milka Nyariro and Mr. Emmanuel Tettey presenting on navigating marginal intersectional identities to achieve educational success for minority students in Ontario, Canada. I would love to introduce and welcome Dr. Rhonda C. George from the University of Guelph.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. So do you
Okay.
see your screen? Yeah.
Okay, sorry, I was having trouble sharing here. 1 second, please. Okay, can you see my slides? Yes, okay. Let's turn on my video. So hi, everybody. Good afternoon. Thank you for having me. My name is Rhonda C. George. I'm an assistant professor in critical race studies and Black studies at the University of Guelph and their Department of Sociology and Anthropology. And today I'm going to be talking to you a little bit about Towards a Black Studies and Education in Canada, ? So this talk is more of a provocation birthed from some newer trajectories in my research. And so just to give you some context, earlier in my career, I focused heavily on matters of educational marginalization of Black students, really focusing on high achieving Black students, Black giftedness, and alternative educational options for Black families, so private school, homeschooling, as well as athletic pathways to university. And what I noticed at that time is that there's a push, much of a push, and rightfully so, regarding the unpacking of Black student experiences, post-secondary, and to support successful graduation or the successful graduation of Black students from high school and their transition to post-secondary. But as time went on in my studies when I was in graduate school, I kept wondering, well, what about after graduating high school? Do we understand what Black students' experiences are in Canadian universities? What happens to these students once they get there? Do we see similar curricular problems that are often articulated in the literature transferring over to the post-secondary context, navigational challenges? And for those of us who study all of this, do we have the things or the tools or infrastructure to actually examine these issues to the best of our ability. And so in true Rhonda fashion, once I get a question in my head, I can't necessarily leave it alone. And it's these kinds of questions that are driving many of the educational parts of my research these days. This is in addition to some work that I've been doing with my colleagues at McMaster University. Together, we formed something called the Black Futurities Project, where we aim to understand and think through the past, present, and future of Black studies in Canada. So together, this has me thinking about what could a Black studies in education look like in Canada? Do we need it in a formal sense, and why? And so just a quick overview to kind of give you a sense of where we're going. First, I'm going to be giving you a working definition of Black studies that I'm engaging with so that we're all on the same page. Key contemporary figures and perspectives, talking through or thinking through the limitations of informal praxis, or what I'm calling informal praxis. Thinking about the potential benefits of doing some of that infrastructural work, and then some discussion questions that maybe we could take up in the Q&A session. And so that we're all on the same page, let's get a working definition of Black studies. This is a picture of the Black Futurities team at our conference last spring, where Dr. Abdul Al-Kalimat, Professor Emeritus at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, he was our keynote speaker, and he is one of the founders of Black Studies in the US. He was part of the Civil Rights Movement, a leader of SNCC, and gave us an environmental scan. And so he's published quite a lot. He wrote one of the first textbooks in Black studies in the US. I find a lot of his work to be essential reading, but some of the key books that we were working on and that are seminal to this project that we're working on, this broader project, are The History of Black Studies and The Future of Black Studies, which are recent publications of his. And so much of my thinking around Black studies is grounded in the work of Al-Kalimat and many others. But, for the purposes of this presentation, I've centered on the work of Al-Kalimat, as well as Holman and Peters. Deidre Holman and Dane Peters are emerging scholars at Columbia University who have been instrumental in developing a K-12 curriculum for Black studies in New York City. And so last year they had a bunch of a series, about 10 or 12 sessions, monthly sessions, kind of launching, if you will, this curriculum. It's about 500 pages, and they had a culminating conference last summer. In having that experience and watching this process and looking at the curriculum, I really saw some overlap and some possibilities of what it would look like if we could do something like this in Toronto or in the GTA, Ontario. And so their work too, and their thinking around Black studies is also informing my thinking. And so just the working definition, it is a branch, or Black studies is a branch of interdisciplinary study that centers the subjectivities and narratives of Black people globally, making them the main agents and or protagonists of research, knowledge creation, cultural creativity, and teaching about Black experience. It is a fundamentally anti-racist space that counters racism, challenges deficit narratives, contributes to Black liberation in its analysis and advocacy for change. It sees the Black experience as one precious case or one path among many in the universality of the human condition. And then lastly, we always have to remember the celebratory part, right? It celebrates the Black experience, its, history, its traditions, its contemporary forms of Black culture. And so in these ways, Al-Kalimat in particular is defining Black studies as a broad set of intellectual activities generated by Black people to rationally and culturally reflect on and celebrate their own experience and to resist structural racism. It evolves in dialogue and struggle with mainstream institutions of power and is a direct response to these notions of deficit, difference, and dependency that are often projected onto Black people. And so, just in having that in the back of your minds, when we look at the Black studies landscape in Canada, we have in the US over 180 undergraduate programs, 40 graduate programs, and not all, but quite a few of these programs, and these are degree granting programs, I should be specific. They include departments and research centers. In Canada, we have one comprehensive undergraduate program, Dalhousie, which launched, I believe, 2023, 2024. One MPH in Black Health, so it's specific to Black Health at University of Toronto, which launched in the past few years. We have several minors and certificates. Also, we have some research centers, but we have no academic departments. And so just thinking about what does this mean for the work in this area and the people doing this work in this area and the ability for the field of Black Studies and Education, the subfield, to flourish. And so, when I was thinking about this, I'm also thinking about, okay, if we were to build out our own canon, what would that look like, right? So just in the interest of time, I didn't include everybody. This is not a comprehensive list by any means. I was just thinking about a few people who have been trailblazers over the last 30 years. So it's only a few, but there are quite a few more. And so I'm thinking about key scholars in the field who have made significant contributions to the field. We're thinking about people like George Day, University of Toronto, really central in our thinking about anti-racist education over the past 30 years, Afrocentrism, Afrocentric education, decolonization and indigeneity. We're thinking about Carl James, empirical studies, lots of empirical studies, structural racism, and thinking about the ways in which education operates as a social structure and how that shapes the outcomes and experiences of Black students. And, a lot of his work, he focuses on the experiences of Black boys. We can also think about people like Njoki Wan, University of Toronto, Black Canadian feminisms, African and Black Canadian women's teaching and learning, African Indigenous knowledges. And then we also have somebody like Annette Henry, UBC, Black women's teachers, intersectional analysis, especially around race and class and language and gender and culture. Thinking about the teaching and learning in Black student life and Black student success. So again, these are just a few. It's definitely not comprehensive, right? So when we think about, or when we look at the Canadian context, there's a way in which we have all these brilliant people doing all this great work. A lot of people are doing some great things around Black students and education and outcomes and experiences, but in many ways they are doing Black studies informally, in the sense that there isn't necessarily the institutional infrastructure to do that work or to support that work. And I mean, we're not even necessarily calling it that per se. And so what does it mean to do this work informally, and what are the implications? And so in my thinking about this, I'm drawing on a quote from Hudson and Kamegisha, who wrote about this in a special issue in the CLR James Journal. It was a special issue on Black Canadian thought in 2014. And they say, and I quote, "The historiography of Black studies in Canada is unmoored institutionally." And I like that use of the word unmoored, and often appears to be reinventing itself with no regard to the past, as successive generations of scholars and intellectuals discover the field. And so again, really thinking about what does that mean for the continuity of this subfield within Black studies, but also to the infrastructural needs. And so when I start to think about, I'm realizing, in examining this, and this is a precursor to a larger project that we're applying for funding for, there's many ways that in the Canadian context, we're doing the work of Black studies, but in an informal way, given the lack of institutional infrastructure. And some of the limitations of that are siloing. A lot of people are scattered. Sometimes they can be isolated. And so in some ways that makes it harder for us to think together, to create together, to build the field more broadly. We also have, for people approaching this work, emerging scholars like myself, junior scholars, graduate students, what are the foundations or canons that we are drawing from? What is our baseline, right, in terms of an intellectual tradition? And so given these issues, from a professorial standpoint, what does supervision and mentorship look like? Do we have the infrastructure in place, rather, theoretically, but also so that one person at random school X, whatever the school is, isn't supervising every single person who's tangentially interested in studying this topic, right? What is the burden on that faculty member, and is the infrastructure in place to actually support the perceived demand that is there? And then again, given this informal practice and the siloing and all of these other issues, what are the implications for intergenerational knowledge transfer? So for the younger generations coming in, how is that knowledge and that work and that advocacy that has been done, how is that knowledge being transferred to the younger generations? And so I'm arguing here, and helping us to really, I'm trying to provoke more discourse around this, of this informal praxis could be a contributing factor to the leaky pipeline, which was articulated in the 2017 book, The Equity Myth by Francis Henry, Ina Dua, and many others. It found in this book that it was found that structural anti-Blackness works in education from kindergarten straight through to the PhD, hampering the possibilities and opportunities for Black people at every stage. At the K-12 level, we see this via, Eurocentric curricula, which is well documented in the literature, in educational institutions, teacher bias, criminalization, we have streaming, we have low expectations. And this has been documented by quite a few people, George Day, Carl James, others. But the equity myth also shows how these barriers also persist in academia and create additional barriers for Black faculty, and are exacerbated by a denial and complacency vis-a-vis a lack of disaggregated race-based data. So in many ways, when it comes to the post-secondary context as it pertains to Black students, there's a lot that we still do not know. But as I am arguing, there's also a lack of infrastructural support to help make the field thrive in the first place. And so the leaky pipeline and informal praxis makes it very difficult to create experts in the field and allow it to thrive. Without the infrastructural supports, I'm really questioning which courses are taught and offered in the area, who teaches them and from which perspectives, which approaches and perspectives are being left out, how do students get exposed to ideas and paradigms and build capacity and a research focus in these areas? And who can even, do we have the infrastructure and the body, the people, the number of people to supervise and mentor these students? And so it really calls into question in this informal praxis who gets to be an expert and under which conditions they get to be an expert, right? How is their ability to teach and train and mentor and theorize being hampered? How are they being stretched thin? When it comes to administration and service, so the hiring, the adjudicating of grants, the promotion and tenure, and actually doing the research, how is that being impeded? What are the conditions of that in this informal ways that it is being practiced? And therefore, how are we getting in the way, or not we, but how is this lack of infrastructure impeding our ability to develop and build expertise about Black Canadians as it pertains to education? And so one of the things I'm also thinking about is, should we standardize? Al-Kalimat in the History of Black Studies contends that standardization, building consensus, and norming research can bolster the field, but also work towards its sustainability, its institutional embeddedness, and thus its permanence. So how can we foster discourse on or around standardization of the field? And what I mean by this is establishing an intellectual and academic baseline for those in the field so that no matter where you're studying, there are key basics and information that you must know to have a broad and deep understanding within the field. And so here are some suggestions, but we're seeing if we're going to get funding to continue this work. But how can we get there, right? So first, I'm saying calling a thing. There has been tireless advocacy from generations of scholars in Canada pushing and pushing and pushing and fighting to establish what we have so far. And I'm wondering if we can have a discussion about where are we? Where do we feel that we collectively are? Intergenerational conversations. And are we happy with where we have landed thus far? Two, community and academic study and discourse to shape our imaginings. So really thinking about what do we want the future to look like of Black studies, and particularly as it pertains to education, what do we want it to look like? what are our collective goals and demands, and what are they being informed by? Number three, learning the do's and don'ts from pre-existing models. So the US has an approximately 60-year head start. 1969 is their formal institutionalization, right? And so they've made mistakes over the years. We've watched them progress. We've seen great things. We've seen not so great things. We've seen the ebbs and flows. What can we actually learn from that as we are building out Black studies in Canada? Four, collectively building some consensus or standardization. So there are so many grad students interested in Black studies or Black education in Canada, but what are the essentials that everyone should read to find what it is that they actually want to explore and get into? Five, so being intentional in terms of strategy and demands for permanent curricular structures. So thinking about programs and departments and the possibilities of what that could look like and what it could do. And so in my mind, I'm always imagining like, what would a department with people all doing this work collectively look like in terms of deciding on admissions, tenure files, building curriculum, sitting on committees? Imagine what could grow or be created in that type of space if it existed. And then six, fostering academic community and a depth of and breadth in the work. And so once we are able to do these things, we would be able to maybe see the landscape more clearly, and there's more space for innovation and creativity and kind of broadening the kind of questions we ask in the field. And so what do we stand to gain? We could potentially be linking ourselves to a broader intellectual tradition, standardization and rootedness, infrastructure, building curriculum, canon, and intergenerational knowledge transfer, depth and breadth and broader possibilities for the kind of work that we do and the kind of research questions we're asking. And then lastly, intentionality and clarity in deliberation and community engagement efforts. So really clarifying our asks and the kind of advocacy. And so these are just, some lingering questions I'm having. Maybe we could take it up in the Q&A. Why have things panned out the way that they have in the Canadian context? What do we stand to lose with standardization? And even like a broader question of like, do we want to standardize? And again, where do we go from here? So thank you very much for your time. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Dr. George. That was wonderful. Given the audience that we have and the personal things, messages I've received, I'm sure we're going to have a very rich discussion. But thank you so much for your presentation. Very, very exciting and engaging. I'm going to now ask you to pause as we introduce our next presenters, Dr. Milka Nyariro and Mr. Emmanuel Tettey. And the presentation topic is going to be navigating marginal intersectional identities to achieve educational success for minority students in Ontario, Canada. Thank you. Okay, so whenever you're ready, you can go ahead, Dr. Nyariro and Mr.
Okay. Can you see my presentation?
Yes, I can see it. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. All right. So I need to come on camera, right? All right.
Yes.
Okay. Okay, so thank you so much, Dr. Alana. My name is Milka Nyariro. I finished my PhD here at McGill in education, in the Faculty of Education, where I explored barriers to school continuation for adolescent mothers in Kenya. And then after that, I went ahead to do postdoctoral studies in the Department of Sociology, still at McGill, where I continued to explore educational inequalities within the Canadian context. And I was looking at the gender and racial inequalities within the Canadian context. And I very much resonate with a lot of things that have been mentioned by the previous presenter about drawing from the US experience, how can we learn from the US experience and replicate or, do the same kind of thing.
I'm sorry to interrupt you. You are in presenter view. You right now you're seeing the.
It's better. Thank you so much. Okay, so thank you so much for that. Yeah, so I'll go straight into our topic, which we did a scoping review study to explore educational interventions for Canadian Black youth. And this is against the backdrop that, oh, I cannot move my slides. Okay. Can you see? Okay, great.
That's fine now.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, so we went on a scoping review to explore educational interventions that are available for Black youth within the Canadian context, given that education is a fundamental human right, but it remains inaccessible to many children around the world. Canada is included in that, although Canada ranks among the top in global evaluation assessments on educational achievements. And some of these contributing factors to educational inequality is socioeconomic status, where the students are coming from, parental educational levels, ethnicity, and racial identities are all factors that intersect together and create educational inequalities in populations. So, why is education important for the youth? First, it will promote nationalism and citizenships. It also promotes equal chances to participate in future socioeconomic and political life in the society. And it intends to bridge the gap of the socioeconomic gap by empowering all the learners. And for youth, this is a very important stage where they discover themselves and also form their identities, and it's the right time, to bring in interventions for those youth that are normally marginalized within the systems. So the paradox of Black youth education in Canada is that not everybody benefits from education equally, and studies have shown that Black youth are still left behind within the Canadian context, and this can affect them, this has effects in other parts of their lives where they can have poor perception of themselves, low self-esteem. They can also develop heightened levels of stress and low aspirations in life generally. So in this scoping review, we had a few questions, 3 questions to explore. First, we wanted to look at the current gap in educational research concerning Black youth within the Canadian context. And our second question, we wanted to explore what the current studies in whether current studies in education for Black youth disaggregate this data by gender, race, ethnicity, and all other identifiers that can intersect to create inequalities in education system. And our third question was we wanted to look at studies and explore if there are any educational interventions that can support Black youth within in achieving their education, in attaining their educational achievement. So these interventions, we wanted to see if there's any policy interventions or community-based interventions that can help Black youth. So I've already explained the objectives. So as I said before, this was a pilot scoping review study where we developed a search strategy and we ran that search strategy on Scopus only. There are many databases such as Web of Science. There are also ERIC, EBSCO, which we did not explore. Because of time, we just wanted to explore this within the Scopus. And the study was guided by Joanna Briggs Institute guidelines, which follows 5 steps. The first step of doing this is to identify a research problem, which we already did by seeing that Black youth do not benefit equally like the rest of the population. And then we developed the research questions that I have mentioned before. And then the second step is to identify relevant studies, which were concerning Black youth education within the Canadian context. And then we went on to select the relevant studies. We charted the data, which we are going to present for you in this presentation, and then summary of our findings. So why did we use a scoping review? First, having conversations with people in the field, there's always this question about how do you know? Where is the evidence that Black youth are disadvantaged in education? So we went into scoping review to do a preliminary evaluation of the size and scope of the available literature on Black youth education within the Canadian context. And then the second reason, we wanted to determine the nature and the scope of research evidence that is available and that is also ongoing on this topic. And the third reason why we employed a scoping review was to provide us with an overview of evidence and to determine if there's a need to adopt different kind of methodologies that would be effective in studying Black youth educational achievements. So first, we developed a search strategy with the help of an expert librarian here at McGill. And this was guided by the PICO's framework, which is population. We looked at the population, which was Black youth between the ages of 10 up to 34 years who are living in Canada. So this would cover elementary, high school, CJEP, or post-secondary education. And then our intervention was education. We also looked at concept, and our concept was Black youth or Black adolescents, teenagers, children, Black students, young adults. And the context we did this was Canada. So initially we wanted to just look at Ontario, but then we realized that there was fewer studies, so we just expanded this to cover the whole of Canada. And then the outcome we were looking for was if there are policy interventions or community-based interventions. So we applied this search on Scopus database only, so it's not very comprehensive, but it gives us a clue of what is out there in terms of research. And after this, we are going to expand this into other databases such as ERIC, PsycInfo, Web of Science, and other collections that are related to education. So our search period was also very limited. We looked at studies between 2000 and 2005. So when we did the first hit using the search strategy, the search produced 96 articles from the Scopus. And then we went ahead to do title and abstract screening, and we applied the following criteria to exclude studies that were not relevant at that point. So we excluded studies that were not written in English. So we only included studies that were conducted in English, so that there's a limitation there. There's a probability that we could have left studies that are relevant but were published in French or any other languages. We also excluded studies that were relevant but are not within the Canadian context. Wrong population, we were only looking at Black youth. However, in our results, we realized that sometimes Black youth are not just studied in isolation, but they're studied in conjunction with other youth from other minority groups. And the fourth exclusion criteria was the wrong outcome. Our outcome here was educational interventions in terms of policy or community-based. So we excluded studies that were on Black youth, but were not touching on educational interventions. Maybe if they were focused on health, we excluded them because that was not the outcome that we were looking at. So after that, we were left with 40 full articles where we explored the full text, and we selected these and exported them into Ryan for a second level of screening. So this Prisma chart shows us how we did the analysis at that point. So at the top here, you can see we had 96, and then we exported it into Ryan. We exported the 40 articles. After doing a selection, we excluded 13 articles. We remained with 27, where we did the full text analysis. During the full text analysis, we also realized that some of these studies were not relevant, so we excluded them. And my colleague, Emmanuel Tettey, is going to present in the following slides. And so the analysis that we are going to present to you today is based on 15 articles that met the eligibility criteria of our study. So I will give it to Mr. Emmanuel Tettey to present study characteristics and the findings. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Prof. So Based on the 15 articles, can you share your screen for me, bro? Based on the 15 articles, we had talking about the study characteristics. Can you share a slide, Prof. Milka? Right. So thank you. Based on the 40 articles presented, as Prof has already mentioned, we're talking about the study characteristics, and during the full text, we excluded 12 articles and we included 15 articles. Yeah. Um, One of the articles which we excluded was because it was out of the field or wrong field, and 11 of them were in wrong context. The publication trends by year, which we have already discussed. In the year 2001 to 2009, we had only one article talking about or in relation to our study. From 2010 to 2020, we had 5 articles, and from 2021 to 2024, we had 9 articles. So looking at the trend, it tells clearly that from 2021 to 2024, there were a lot of publications in this particular area, which shows clearly that this particular area is very important and researchers' attention has been drawn to that. Talking about the participant age distribution, range from 15 to 18 years, we have 2 studies discussing that. 18 to 25 years, we have 4 articles or papers. 26 to 35 years, we have 1 paper, and some papers did not really state the exact years that they were using to conduct the study. It was just mixed up, and we had 8 of them. Talking about the sample size analysis, some studies mentioned that they are going to use 5, others mention 10, others mention 15. The statistics here shows that the minimum sample size, which was stated in one of the papers, was 5. The maximum was 105,441. This is so huge, and of course, it was a census, and you know, census covers a wide number of people on the total population within a geographical area. That's why we had the maximum number of people here being 105,441. The median sample size was 30, and the mean was 12,320.7. In all this, we are talking about total studies, which was included in our study to be 15 of them. Now, we talk about the research approaches which were applied in the various studies. Out of the 15 articles, we realized that only 2 of them talked about quantitative, whilst 13 of them talks about qualitative studies. Moving forward to publication avenues, you know, there are a lot of journals out there which people try to publish their articles or papers. When you look at these statistics carefully, it shows clearly that the Journal of Youth Studies recorded the highest, the Canadian Review of Sociology recorded the highest of all, which is 3. And the Journal of Youth Studies also recorded the second highest to be 2. And the rest, Journal of Nursing Education, the Journal of Canadian Studies, Child and Adolescent Social Work Journal, Research in Comparative and International Education, Urban Studies, Review of Education, Pedagogy and Cultural Studies, and Learning in Medicine, Canadian Society for the Study of Education, International Migration, Race, Ethnicity, and Education. All these articles recorded 1 each of papers, which is really related to our study. Now, we came out with some thematic findings. The thematic analysis of the key findings were structural and institutional barriers to education, socio-economic and racial inequalities in educational attainment, racism and discrimination in academic spaces, geographic and parental influence on educational outcomes. We talked about distrust in institutions and authorities and the lack of representation and inclusion in curriculum and workforce. These are the thematic analysis of our key findings, but there were some kind of overlaps because some of the studies were not really talking about one side of the thematic analysis. So you could get a particular study talking about three different themes, which we have already mentioned. And as you can see the analysis on the screen, the first theme, which is the structural and institutional barriers to education, recorded 9. So it means that we have different articles or different papers talking about the structural and institutional barriers to education. The socio-economic and racial inequalities in educational attainment recorded 7. Racism and discrimination in academic spaces recorded 6. 8 to be challenges faced by vulnerable youth. 5 geographic and parental influence on educational outcomes. Distrust in institutions and authorities recorded 5. And representation and inclusion in curriculum and workforce also 4. So even though we are talking about 15 articles included in the study, but the number, because would not add up to 15. Now we come to the key implications. We had 3 key implications here, and one of them was policy interventions, which talks about one size fits all policies being ineffective and intersectional approaches, which is really needed. Then we come to the educational reforms. There is the need to address systematic racism, increase representation, and then include diverse histories in curriculum. We come to some of the support mechanisms. It is very key that we enhance career counseling for marginalized youth, create mentorship programs, and implement anti-racism training in education. In this regard, we also have a particular or graphical representation of the key implications here as stated. And as I have already mentioned, there were some kind of overlaps. So as the chart is shown clearly, not all the articles talk about one area. So some of the key implications were policy interventions, which recorded 8, one size fits all, which is a sub. Under the policy intervention, we have 5, and the intersectional approaches also under the policy intervention, we had 6. The educational reforms, we had 9 of them, and support mechanisms, we had 10. Now we move on to the recommendations from the included studies. So out of the 15 studies we included, what were some of the recommendations made by the studies? And one of them was that institutional and policy reforms are very key, which we need to pay attention to. Anti-racism and decolonization in education is one of them. Diversity, inclusion, and representation is one. And the last but not the least is support for marginalized youth and educators. So we have a graphical representation talking about the recommendation from the included studies. 9 of them, of course, there were some kind of overlaps. So 9 of them talking about institutional and policy reforms, 10 talking about anti-racism and decolonization in education, diversity, inclusion, and representation, we had 8 of them, and support for marginalized youth, we had 11 of them. Milka will continue from the study findings and conclusions.
So from this study, we had our own conclusions, and the first is that there was no policy or community interventions on Black youth education support within the 15 studies that we analyzed. And the second conclusion we got from these studies are the current studies on Black youth education do not disaggregate data by sex, gender, race, ethnicity, and all those other identifiers. So it makes it very difficult to understand the unique needs of these groups, which vary greatly. And then the third is that there is a need to adopt different methodologies when studying Black youth educational achievements. For example, we can adopt qualitative and participatory approaches to research to capture the nuances of marginal, intersectional identities that interact to put Black youth at a disadvantage in achieving their educational outcomes. So that is the end of our presentation, and we look forward to the discussion and question and answer. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Nyariro and Mr. Emmanuel Tettey for your presentation. And I look forward to seeing that in published form. I think that would be very informative. Now, I want to thank Dr. Rhonda George and Dr. Milka Nyariro and Mr. Emmanuel Tettey for your presentation today. It was just wonderful. As you can see, lots of discussion, lots of interest in this, and it's so exciting to see this today. So I want to thank you both for your wonderful presentations, and we look forward to our next session next month. So thanks everyone for attending and for your questions and discussion.